Welcome to Jay's Analysis. Next, as I said, we would cover Bertrand Russell's impact of science on society. Bertrand Russell, who I now am convinced is Ricardo Montalban, and he's on Darwin's fantasy island with Tattoo, his mental midget projection out of his own mind, who is telling him that he can look at the beaks of the finches and he can derive all of these great propositions about the history of man and man's origins. Fantasy Scientism Island, Ricardo Montalban, aka Bertrand Russell. Now, what are we going to talk about in today's talk at Jay's Analysis? Well, if you recall, in the Globalist book series, we did Bertrand Russell's scientific outlook. Wow, what an amazing collection of contradictions and strange statements and prophetic insight, insofar as Russell was one of these key characters in the Royal Society in terms of steering the future. One of the brains, as we might say. So 1931 on this one, and we saw, as I went through point by point by point in my talk, you can find that at Jay's Analysis, dissecting it. We're going to do the same thing here. And as we saw last time, there was no clear definition or explanation of what science is. Science was so elastic as to mean, on the one hand, the scientific method, and on the other hand, a completely dogmatic philosophy. That will all be repeated in this book. Now, this book, in 1953, is a Nobel Prize winner. All he did was rehash everything that he wrote in the old book. Literally rehashed it. Like the first couple chapters are almost exactly the same. And it's a Nobel Prize winner. What that shows you, this is like Obama getting the Nobel Prize. What that shows you is that is a joke. The award, right, of the Nobel Prize is the same as like Hollywood giving Weinstein an award. It's no different. These awards are forms of propaganda. Now with Russell, we get right away, why do we need to turn to science? Because the God of the Old Testament is mean. What does the God of the Old Testament being mean have to do with science? Well, it has not really anything to do with the scientific method, but if you're writing a book on propaganda, and that's what this is, pop scientism, then it makes perfect sense why you would go for the Old Testament. The Old Testament God is savage, he says, right? And a few pages later, Bertrand Russell argues for mass depopulation. So if theoretically, let's say that the God of the Old Testament was savage, which that's not true. In fact, the examples that he gives, like Abraham and Isaac, that is actually a treatise against human sacrifice, showing that this God, the true God, does not condone human sacrifice. That's the whole point of that lesson. But of course, Bertrand Russell misinterprets that and tries to say that it means that God actually kind of wanted human sacrifice. But now, what's funny is that Russell goes on to say that it's good for the state to depopulate on a mass scale. Mass depopulation, at the behest of the state, human sacrifice for the state, that's A-okay, buddy. Yes, that's awesome. But if a so-called God did it, which is not true, it's savage. So, in other words, savagery at the behest of the state is fine. So that's right there. Contradiction number one. Now, there's no purpose in nature, is the next argument that he goes to. And if there's no purpose in nature, then it follows that there's no purpose in our lives. And Bertrand Russell follows this out logically. He says, yes, that's true. There's no purpose in our lives. No purpose at all. Now, if there's no purpose in our lives and there's no purpose in our thought processes either, then there's no purpose in the sentences that we convey. And yes, that follows. That's consistent, sure. Okay, I'll go there. Now, if there's no purpose in our sentences, then the books that we write have no purpose. You can't remove telos from the external world, which is what Russell admits that this whole project was involved in, and then turn around and say, well, there's telos in my own subjective books that I write. These have a purpose. There's no purpose anywhere else out there in the universe. It's all one vast a giant machine that's winding down to destroy humanity. But my book has purpose. The plan that is outlined in this book is a complete technocracy. And Russell goes on to argue, like H.G. Wells and like many of the books that we covered in this Globalist book series, even with Miles Copeland, the CIA guy, all the same principles. Why are they all saying the same thing? That's because they're all on board with the same plan. What is that plan? The nation state must end. There must be no more borders. Russell says we got to get rid of that stuff. There must be an international body to supersede the League of Nations, which has failed, which actually has a monopoly on global warfare. So there has to be a global government. The United Nations obviously comes to take its place. Russell is a big promoter of that. But now Russell goes on to talk about science and values in a chapter where we are confused as to his moral opprobrium here for certain actions that, again, he later says it's good for the state to do. So he has a problem with Christian society and theology and the Bible and because of mean things. Then he goes on to say that those things are absolutely necessary and great when the state does it, the world state, the coming super state, the technocratic state. Contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. And again, in my other video on Scientific Outlook, I covered a mass of those contradictions. So I'm not going to rehash all those. But I will go to another one of the famous statements that Bertrand Russell talks about altering man through diet, injections, and injunctions, and that this will significantly change the population, and that we will eventually have GMO babies, and then in the future, the world state can absolutely regulate every aspect of everybody's lives. So here we have it. This is, of course, just the introductory discussion here. We have a full hour plus analyzing each chapter of the book. The archives at Jay's Analysis, you can get that on the basis of subscription service at my site, jaysanalysis.com, for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. You can also get copies of my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which the sequel will be out soon. I'm presently about a third of the way through writing the sequel. Over 100, almost probably 150 by now, maybe. 5-star reviews across all the platforms, so definitely something worth checking out. I cover Bertrand Russell quite a bit, actually, and you might think, well, what does Bertrand Russell have to do with Hollywood? Well, actually quite a bit, because we don't tend to think of it, but scientism has been heavily promoted through Hollywood, specifically through the examples of the H.G. Wells films, many of those, that had a tremendous impact on Hollywood. We've also seen it in Star Trek and all this kind of, scientism worship through the Federation. And that's actually how Bertrand Russell ends this book. So once again, this is pop science propaganda. We saw this with H.G. Wells, where H.G. Wells wrote this whole book about we got to have a world government, we got to kill everybody. But hey, it's okay because once we kill everybody, once we especially target the white population, and then, Bertrand Russell, by the way, in this book says, now the Russians are the problem. We got to target the Russian population because their stupid Christian civilization is holding us back. We got to bring their numbers down. So let's export abortion. Let's export death. Let's export all of this degeneracy to Russia. And that's why Bertrand Russell worked with the Frankfurt School and with the OSS and the CIA to promote degeneracy in the arts. It's all in the book. All you idiot haters and deniers out there, there's countless books already written on this. You can go read Francis Stoner Saunders' Cultural Cold War book, which I'll be citing in my book in many cases in the sequel, which deals with the same stuff. The CIA influencing the arts to spread degeneracy. Wasn't all the commies, right? Now, Bertrand Russell was a big fan of the commies, but he's also a big fan of the Western intelligence degeneracy that he was a big part of, right? BBC, MI6. And together, these dialectical monstrosities, these two snakes on the head of Medusa, are busy promoting two different forms of degeneracy that are intended. In this book, Bertrand Russell says that East and West need to come together in the third way. So he actually outlines the third way perspective here. Scientism is the key, and it will be the scientific technocracy that merges the realms of the Eastern communists with the Western so-called capitalists. That was the plan all along, And it was a big geopolitical chess move, and Bertrand Russell proves that, backs that up in his books. So go to Jay's Analysis and subscribe for the full talk. Thank you for watching. Also, please, right here, subscribe to my channel. Help me get to 20,000. I've noticed some shady things on the part of YouTube here with the numbers that don't seem to be adding up. But you can help me out by sharing my stuff. Thank you.